Order, order. We start with questions to Secretary of State for Justice. Dan Corden.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Question number 1.
Thank you. With permission, Mr Speaker, I will answer questions 1 and 16 together. Today, Mr Speaker, is the day those opposite always knew was coming. The legacy of the last government was a prison system on the brink of collapse, and they left us with no choice. So today, around 1,700 offenders have had to be released a few weeks or months early by changing the automatic release point for some offenders from 50% to 40% of their sentence. If we had not done this, we faced courts unable to hold trials, police unable to make arrests, and a total breakdown of law and order. This is not the long-term solution. There is more that we must do, but it was the necessary first step that we had to take following the disgraceful dereliction of duty by the previous government.
Dan Corden.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer honourable members to my entry in the Register of Interests. One way to reduce pressure on numbers is to treat more offenders with drug and alcohol addictions outside of the prison estate, reducing prisoner numbers, reducing reoffending, which means fewer victims and fewer people returning to prison. This is operating successfully in many parts of the country, but it requires the highest quality treatment. It requires probation to work well, otherwise magistrates are limited in their choices. Can I encourage the Secretary of State to get hold of Dame Carol Black's internal review of treatment and recovery of drug-dependent people in the secure estate, if she hasn't already? I haven't seen it, obviously, but I am certain it will contain many excellent recommendations.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. He is right that good quality work on reoffending to reduce rehabilitation, to deal with drug and alcohol issues is absolutely critical to deal with not just the rehabilitation of offenders but the prison system as well. He will know nearly 80% of offending is reoffending. That number is far too high. The situation we're in at the moment, though, is that it's impossible to do good quality rehabilitative work in prisons that are over 99% full, locking up prisoners for 23 hours a day. So the first step is to address capacity. Once we have done so, we will be able to, of course, build on recommendations made by experts in this area to make sure that we're doing everything we can to reduce reoffending.
Andrew Ranger.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for that answer. My constituency of Wrexham is home to one of the UK's largest prisons. It is well known that if an offender has fixed and secure accommodation to go to, then they are less likely to reoffend. Can she tell me what steps is she taking to ensure that those released under SDS 40 today will have accommodation upon release, including in Wrexham?
We're working closely with MHCLG colleagues to understand the impact on the housing sector. But as with any time a prisoner is released, probation staff are working hard to prepare release plans, including permanent and temporary accommodation. If an offender is at risk of homelessness upon release, they will be housed in community accommodation, and we expect to provide housing for the majority of offenders using existing provision. But should there not be enough provision, I have authorised probation directors to make use of alternative arrangements, including budget hotels, as a temporary measure for the cases that we will see in the next few weeks.
Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. During the debate in July around early prisoner release, the impact assessment produced suggests that there'd be 5,500 less prison places than planned for, due to make the capital savings that were discussed at the time. When I raised this with the Secretary of State, she did say that this would be under review. Can she now confirm that it's the government's intention to cut back prison places by 5,500 over the medium and long term?
The Right Honourable Lady will know that I've committed to publishing a 10-year capacity strategy. There are also live discussions as part of the budget and spending review process. We have committed to delivering the shortfall of 14,000 places in our prison system that the previous government failed to deliver. That is a commitment we have given. Those conversations are live conversations. I will report to the House in due course, but we will be publishing a 10-year capacity strategy before the end of the year.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Secretary of State explain why, when there are some 10,000 foreign criminals blocking up space in our jails, why aren't they being removed and deported, simultaneously saving the British taxpayer billions of pounds every year and having the support of millions of British voters?
They are being deported. They will continue to be deported. Nothing will change as far as deportation of foreign national offenders is concerned, but the inheritance that we had from the previous government meant we had to take further additional measures. The answer won't come from deportation of foreign national offenders alone, but it is very much part of the picture.
We come to the Shadow Secretary, Heidi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under the early release scheme that the Secretary of State, designed the detail of starting today, how many people will be eligible to be released at the 40% point who have been sentenced for offences, for example, under Section 20 GBH, Section 47 ABH of the Offence Against the Person Act 1861, both of which carry a maximum sentence of 5 years, but more often a sentence will be awarded that is less than 5 years?
Well, the Shadow Lord Chancellor will know that we have made important exclusions to the design of this policy, and all those who have committed serious offences, who have been sentenced to 4 years or more, will be excluded from this policy. He will know that I will not be able to give details on the specific mix of offences per offender, but those offences that should be included that relate to serious violence or sexual offences have been excluded from this policy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to the Secretary of State, but I have the statutory instrument and the list of exclusions on the schedule here, and those offences are not specifically excluded in that list of exclusions. So what I fear will be deeply disappointing is that many domestic abusers will potentially actually be considered convicted for those offences, have received fewer than 5 years, and therefore potentially be eligible for early release. And her scheme, as I say, does not explicitly exclude those offences. Given that, the reality is that the government's claim domestic abusers won't be eligible to benefit from this scheme will ring very hollow to victims of domestic abuse and the wider public, won't it?
I say with respect to the Shadow Lord Chancellor, what will ring hollow to members of the public is the Tory party's newfound commitment to exclusions for domestic abuse, the sheer hypocrisy of talking about exclusions to this policy when he was himself a minister in the previous government who brought in the end of custody supervised licence scheme, which had no exclusions relating to domestic abuse whatsoever. And in fact, and he says he talks about the governor lock from his sedentary position. He knows full well that was an attempt to take the blame away from ministerial decision making and place it with governors, something I'm not sure was much appreciated by those who are currently running our prisons. We have taken every step available to us and every mechanism available to us to exclude offences connected to domestic abuse, and crucially, something that the previous government never did, give the probation service time to prepare.
Liberal Democrat spokesman Lee Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's quite clear our prisons are at breaking point. The Conservatives' failure to tackle the court's backlog has directly contributed to prison overcrowding. Thanks to their neglect and mismanagement, the government have been left with no choice but to take these measures. However, Mr. Speaker, the Lord Chancellor said in her statement in July that these measures would be reviewed within 18 months of implementation, at the very latest in March 2026. That's a long time away, particularly given the various stories we're hearing about certain individuals being released. So will the Secretary of State once again confirm that no dangerous criminals will be released early?
Let me say to the honourable gentleman, we have taken every measure available to us to exclude offences from this measure. That includes serious violence, sexual violence, offences connected to domestic abuse, all have been excluded, as are terror offences and so on. He will know the full list of exclusions. We will work with our probation service, who have done a heroic amount of work over the summer in order to deliver this policy going forward in the coming months. We will also work very closely with criminal justice system partners as well to make sure that the rollout of this scheme is as safe as possible. So we've taken every measure. We will continue to keep that under review, and I will keep the House updated in due course.
We need to speed up a little. We're still only going to question 2. Bobby Dean.
Number 2, please, Mr. Speaker. With permission, Mr Speaker, I will answer questions 2, 9 and 15 together. The honourable member is right to focus on reducing reoffending. Nearly 80% of offending is reoffending at an immense cost to the taxpayer and communities. But as the Lord Chancellor has already said, we've inherited a very difficult situation in relation to prison capacity, which makes it harder to address the rehabilitation needs of prisoners. But have no doubt that this government will roll its sleeves up and get on with that job of reducing reoffending.
Dean.
I thank the Minister for his answer. My point actually speaks to what he addressed in his statement. The lack of prison capacity means that some people are locked up in their cells for 22 or 23 hours a day. And so that means many prisons are ranked insufficient or poor for delivering purposeful activities like education and training. So how does the Minister plan to address this whilst we still have a bulging prison population? How are we going to increase the provision of those purposeful activities?
We're taking the hard decisions that are necessary to create the space and capacity in the prison service to address this. He's right that HMIP's number one thing to be addressed in their latest report was this issue about providing sufficient purposeful activity. We know that education and employment helps to reduce the chance of reoffending significantly, and that's what we will work to do with the prison and probation service.
Can I just say to the Minister, he's meant to sit down. I know he's enjoying the dispatch box on his return, but please don't over-enjoy it. Monica Harding.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As my honourable friend referred to, the Chief Inspector of Prisons this morning said we find prisoners banged up in their cells sometimes for up to 22 hours a day, and classrooms that are empty, workshops that are empty, and education and training simply isn't given the priority that it should in our prisons. Does the Secretary of State therefore agree that it is time to introduce a proper, workable plan to improve the rehabilitation of people leaving prison to cut reoffending?
As my own self demonstrates that training and education are very important in whatever role you're taking on. So I agree wholeheartedly with what the member said.
Paul Davis.
Addressing literacy in UK prisons is crucial for successful rehabilitation. Improved literacy skills empower inmates with better job prospects, aiding their reintegration into society. Education fosters personal growth, self-esteem and decision-making abilities, which are essential for a crime-free life. Investing in prison literacy programmes is a vital step towards creating safer communities and offering inmates a genuine second chance. Can I ask the Minister what comprehensive strategies are being implemented to address this issue?
Well, the honourable member is exactly right that literacy and numeracy are crucial issues. And when I was pleased to visit HMP Humber recently, I saw some excellent best practice going on. And it is important that those programmes are in place and that we learn from best practice and we continue to do our best in that area.
Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. A key driver of rehabilitation and prevention of reoffending is sentencing policy. In our manifesto, we promised a review of sentencing policy quite properly. Could the Minister say when this is likely to take place? And will it take account of a very interesting recent paper by the former Lord Chiefs on sentencing inflation?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. That paper to which he refers is a very significant paper, and I urge all members to have a look at it. This government is committed to a review on sentencing policy, and that will commence as soon as it can and will report in due time.
Question
number 3, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 3, 4, 7, 21, 23 and 24 together. Now, this government is deeply committed to supporting victims of rape and sexual violence. To do this, we will increase the powers of the Victims Commissioner and get victims the information they need, provide free legal advocates to uphold the rights of victims of rape, and fast-track rape cases to drive down waiting times for these victims of these abhorrent offences.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last week, Emmerdale aired an upsetting episode dealing with the domestic abuse suffered by Belle Dingle. The storyline has shown just how difficult it can be for someone to leave an abusive relationship, not least because of the psychological control exercised by abusers. Some victims also need somewhere to go for safety. According to the latest figures available, Scarborough has the highest rate of domestic abuse incidents reported in North Yorkshire, but there is still no refuge for victims in the town. Will my right honourable friend work with me, colleagues across government and stakeholders to find the funding to make sure that a refuge finally opens in Scarborough at last?
Can I thank my honourable friend for that question? As an avid Emmerdale fan, I did see that harrowing episode, and it just goes to show the importance of TV drama in raising awareness of these vital issues. This government is committed to halving violence against women and girls within a decade. The MOJ is working with government departments across Whitehall, including MHCLG, to support local authorities to meet their statutory duties, including refuges to all victims of domestic abuse who need it. We know, though, that there is not just refuge support, which is important, but wider community-based support, and the MOJ provides funding to police and crime commissioners to commission these vital services for victims.
Jane Curtin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Victims of alleged rape in Truro and Falmouth and across the country are having their trials pushed back for months, if not years, often very shortly before those trials were set to begin. This leads to severe distress for victims and families and can have unintended consequences like bail conditions becoming outdated as victims wait so long for their cases to come to trial that they change address in the meantime. Please could the Minister outline what she's doing to prevent or minimise potential harm caused by such unintended consequences and bring these long delayed cases to a speedy conclusion?
I thank my honourable friend for highlighting just the awful status of our criminal justice system that we were left with from the previous government. We are committed to ensuring that swift justice for delivery for justice for victims at all stages of the criminal justice system, and we are working closely with various partners to achieve that aim. We know that due to their complexity, rape victims often wait disproportionately longer than other victims of other offence types for their trial, and reducing waiting times for victims is a priority for me and this government, which is why we have committed to fast-tracking rape cases through the justice system. And I saw this first-hand, Mr. Speaker, just recently at Bristol Crown Court of how this can be done and how our judges are working tirelessly to make this happen.
Dan Aldridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many will be watching with horror the extraordinarily disturbing case unfolding in France, in which drugs were allegedly used to facilitate the abuse of a woman by her husband and over 70 men. Like many across this House, I have received communication from victims of spiking in my town, Weston-super-Mare. They, like I, am keen to know what steps she is taking to crack down on the devastating crime of spiking here in the UK.
I thank my honourable friend. This case in France is truly shocking, and we have all looked on in horror as the details have unfolded. I commend the bravery of the victim for coming forward and making this public so that we can see the full aspects of this trial. Spiking is a despicable crime. We have committed to introducing a new criminal offence for spiking, and we are considering how best to implement this. But to be clear, in England and Wales, having sex with a person who cannot consent is rape. And spiking with intent to engage in sexual activity is a specific offence with a maximum penalty of up to 10 years in prison.
Rachael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 10 years ago, Jack and Paul Sykes, aged 12 and 9 respectively, tragically lost their lives at the hands of their abusive father, who set their house on fire. Their mother, my constituent, Claire Throssell, is a powerful campaigner against presumptive contact, a legal principle which allowed a known domestic abuser to access Jack and Paul. Will the Minister meet with Claire and I to discuss how we can properly protect children from domestic abuse in our family court system?
I thank my honourable friend for this really important question. Claire's tireless campaigning for families and children experiencing domestic abuse is inspirational, and I would like to place on record my thoughts with Claire and all of the community as the anniversary comes closer next month, Mr. Speaker. Both the criminal and family justice systems will play an essential role in delivering our commitment to halve violence against women and girls. The family court system must protect child victims of domestic abuse, and the new Pathfinder courts provide more support for domestic abuse agencies and ensure the child's welfare and voice is centred in the proceedings from the outset. This government and I take the need to respond robustly to perpetrators within the family courts very seriously, and I know the previous government was reviewing the presumption of parental involvement. We are now considering these findings and will respond in due course.
Anna Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to draw the Minister's attention to the work of Bradford Council and West Yorkshire Mayor Tracy Brabin. who have launched the Safety of Women and Girls initiative, together with a dedicated women's safety unit within West Yorkshire Police. I'd like to ask the Minister what support the Government can offer to bolster the efforts of local authorities like Bradford in stamping out violence against women and girls in our communities. Thank you.
Speaker, this also gives me the opportunity to place on record my thanks to Mayor Tracy Braben for all the incredible work she's doing in this field. She's an outstanding champion for tackling the violence against women and girls, and it is more work like hers we should be doing across government. We are committed, as I've said, to halving violence against women and girls within a decade. We are supporting colleagues across Whitehall, including MHCLG, to ensure that we have that cross-collaboration with local authorities, and in addition, under the Victims and Prisoners Act 2024, the duty to collaborate will facilitate improved multi-agency working and encourage all local commissioners to provide joined-up working for victims of all crimes, including violence against women and girls.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was this time last year that the Lord Chancellor announced her intention to introduce free legal advocates so that victims of rape can enforce their rights. For example, in relation to the use of their personal information in court. Can the Minister tell us what progress she has made in bringing forward this vital new protection for victims?
This government was clear that in our manifesto we are committed to introducing free, independent legal advice to victims and survivors of rape from report to trial. I am working with officials to develop this new policy and to ensure that victims get the support that they need to understand and uphold their rights as soon as possible. I plan to draw on lessons learned from the successful pilots of this in Northumbria, as well as from the Mayor of London's current ILA pilot.
Right, Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Public Accounts Committee in the last session looked at the effect of delays in the criminal justice system on serious sexual and rape cases, it found that some cases were taking 5 years or more from prosecution to come into trial, and that some of the poor traumatised victims were simply disappearing because they couldn't stand it any longer. Without entering into the blame game, what can the Minister do to improve that situation?
Well, I thank the right honourable member for that question. He's right that although we don't want to get into the blame game, the status in the current criminal justice system, because rape trials are not getting as fast-tracked as they will be, is truly appalling, and we are working at pace to try and remedy this. We know that currently 60% of rape victims are pulling out of the criminal justice system. The attrition rate is far too high. I am working with officials to improve this and to improve victim experience at court.
Right, Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How many prisoners are going to be released today in Kent, and can the Secretary of State guarantee that none of them will be homeless within a month?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. As the Lord Chancellor previously said, we can't give exact figures for specific areas, but we have working with other departments, local authorities, MHCLG, to ensure that those who are being released from prison today under SDS 40 have the right accommodation that they need, and the probation service has been working around the clock to ensure this.
Right, I think that did push the boundaries a little bit. I think it was mainly about those who were rapists that have been released. I think that would have been the question. Right, let us come to Jim Shannon.
Speaker, I thank the Minister for her answers, but what discussions has the Minister had with the Education Minister in relation to supporting the victims of rape and sexual assault who are under 18 years of age within our educational institutions? Thank you.
I thank the honourable member for his question. He will know that this government has a mission to tackle violence against women and girls, and that mission is pulling together, as I've already said, departments across Whitehall, including the Department for Education. I recently had a meeting with the Minister in Education to discuss just this, but as I was clear, rape with anyone who cannot consent is a crime, and we are tackling this and working across government to do so.
Josh Bobberinda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know from my own experience that independent sexual violence advisors provided by amazing charities like Survivors UK are critical guides to help survivors to navigate their paths to justice and to peace. So could the Minister commit to redoubling her support for ISVAs and the organisations that make them available to the survivors who need them?
I thank the honourable member for his question. I know he is passionate in this field of justice. And it also gives me the opportunity to put on record my thanks to the ISVAs who do immense work across this field, day in, day out, supporting victims of these abhorrent crimes. We know that the work they do is totally invaluable, and this government is committed to introducing independent legal advocates to help victims and survivors get the support that they need. And we are working with our stakeholders across the sector to ensure that this support is available.
Lindsay Falmouth.
Question 5, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I will answer questions 5 and 17 together. The criminal justice system rose to the challenge brought by the violent disorder we saw over the summer. As of the 22nd of August, 576 individuals have been brought before the courts. Of those, 123 have been sentenced to a custodial sentence by the Crown Court.
Lindsay Palmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As a Crown prosecutor for 21 years, I know only too well that the court backlog has been worsened by the repair issues facing courts to close. What is the Minister doing to address the repairs needed to the court estate so that the victims in my constituency of Amber Valley and across the country can get access to justice?
Thank the Honourable Member for that question. It is, of course, crucial that courts are in a position where the building and the infrastructure itself does not prevent a court from being able to sit. It will be a priority for this government to resolve those issues so that cases can be heard and victims can be given the justice that they deserve.
Alex Baker.
Mr Speaker, it is clear that we've come dangerously close to running out of prison places in the last few months, which, as the Prime Minister has rightly said, is about as fundamental failure as you can get. Can I ask the Lord Chancellor who she blames for this failure and whether she thinks we will ever get a word of apology from the party opposite for leaving our prison estate on the brink of disaster?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'll happily give way to anybody on the opposite benches if they would like to take the invitation to offer an apology. But I think one will not be forthcoming. I certainly do think that one is required, given the state of the prison system that we have inherited. But it's our job to make sure that that never happens again. That is why we will be launching a review into how this current position was allowed to come to pass. The party opposite ignored all the warnings, putting political gain ahead of the country's best interests, and it will fall to this government to fix it.
Neil O'Brien.
Thank you. The government have quite rightly found prison places for those involved in the recent disorder, but they've done that by continuing with their early release policy. Will the Secretary of State confirm that those guilty of manslaughter are among those who will be able to get early release? And will she explain to the House why people guilty of manslaughter should be able to be early released?
I think the honourable member opposite is guilty of willful ignorance. He will know full well that the prison system that we inherited was on the point of collapse. The fact that some prison bill that was already in course was able to be brought online a little earlier to help us get over the crisis of the summer, I think is a testament to the people working at the front line and making sure that those prison spaces were available. But we are still short of prison capacity. It's still at 99%, over 99% capacity, and that is the legacy left by his government. He will know we have important exclusions to the SDS 40 policy. He will know also that the offence and the sentence are both taken into account. I won't give a running commentary on exactly which sentences and which offenders are affected, but he knows what exclusions are in place.
Sarah Coombs.
Number 6, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. This government is committed to improving victim experience at court. We will work with the judiciary to fast-track rape cases to ensure timely justice for some of the most vulnerable within the criminal justice system. Additionally, this government committed to our manifesto to introducing free, independent legal support to support victims of rape from report to trial. We have also committed to strengthening the Victims Code and increase the Victims Commissioner's powers to make sure victims' needs are met.
Sarah Coombs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. For victims, giving evidence in court can sometimes be a very difficult and distressing experience, which is why they sometimes prefer to give evidence via video link. Can the Minister set out what steps the government is taking to ensure that more victims can give evidence via video link across our country?
My honourable friend for that important question. Video links are available in all courts to help vulnerable and intimidated witnesses give evidence. We have recently invested £50,000 to transform witness facilities and upgrade video link rooms in 10 Crown courts. Pre-recorded evidence is also available in all Crown courts for eligible victims to spare them the trauma of giving evidence at a live trial.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To ensure that victims see justice, criminal cases need to be heard in a timely manner, which relies on the number of courts being in place to be able to hear them. The future of Chichester Crown Court, which is the only Crown Court in West Sussex, has been under threat for nearly a decade, and local campaigners fought to save that provision, leading to it reopening to clear the backlog, but its future remains uncertain. Will the Minister meet with me to ensure the future of Chichester Crown Court?
I thank the honourable member for that question. We know that courtroom availability is essential to achieving the backlog, and I will pass on that message to the Courts Minister.
Josh McAllister.
Question number 8, Mr Speaker.
First of all, the first thing to say is that my honourable friend is completely right that prison officer recruitment targets are essential. Prison officers do a fantastic job, and we've seen how they've gone above and beyond over recent weeks and months, so I pay tribute to them. Nationally, we are currently above staffing targets. However, challenges remain in certain sites with a high number of vacancies, and bespoke interventions are being developed for those sites. Thank you.
Josh McAllister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for the answer and also praise the government team for the way in which they've responded to the complete chaos left in the wake of 14 years of a Conservative government. In my previous work, I'd visited young offenders institutes as well, and they've been left in total chaos after the last government. Part of that recklessness was to start a botched recruitment process for the graduate recruitment training programme for prison officers. It's currently delivered by Unlocked, who are doing fantastic work, and the government's own Chief Inspector of Prisons has said that there is a real risk that that programme ending will add to the recruitment problems that the government faces. So I would ask the government, will they restart that procurement process, and will they meet with me to discuss the future of it?
Well, first of all, I say I'm very happy to meet with my honourable friend to discuss this matter. HMPPS worked to re-procure the next iteration of the graduate scheme contract through an open procurement exercise. Although Unlocked graduates were identified as the winning bidder and were offered the contract, they did not confirm their intent to sign the contract. The department is now working hard to come up with plans to put a graduate scheme in place for future years.
Jonathan Brash.
Number 10, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's good to be back. With permission, Mr Speaker, I will answer questions 10 and 25 together. We are committed to reducing caseloads and bringing waiting times down for court users across all jurisdictions. We continue to keep 18 Nightingale courtrooms open across 8 venues, so we have more physical capacity to hear cases in all jurisdictions. We plan to sit over 105,000 days at the Crown Court and over 102,000 days in the Family Court this financial year, enabling us to work through as many cases as possible.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Hartlepool's court building has stood empty since 2017 after it was mothballed by the then Conservative government. Will my right honourable friend investigate the potential of reopening Hartlepool's court as part of our efforts to expand capacity and clear the backlog? And will she meet with me to discuss this issue further?
I hear you, Mr Speaker, and I welcome the question from my honourable friend, the member for Hartlepool. He will know that the Courts and Tribunals Service keeps the court estate under regular review to ensure it meets operational requirements. I'm afraid to say there are currently no plans to reopen Hartlepool Magistrates Court, but I would be very happy to meet with him alongside officials from HMCTS to discuss his concerns. I would say that the reasons behind the increased caseload in our criminal courts are complex and multifaceted, but the number of courtrooms available is not the main constraint we face at the moment.
Darling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Torquay Magistrates Court closed within the last decade, and therefore justice is served somewhat distant from our communities in Torbay. Can you assure us that there will be some reviews to make sure that justice is served more locally to our communities in South Devon? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I think I may be having another meeting with the honourable gentleman, as well as looking at the court in Chorley, Mr Speaker, and I'm happy to discuss that matter with the honourable gentleman.
Rebecca Smith.
Question number 11, Mr Speaker.
This government is deeply committed to supporting domestic abuse victims. We provide funding to police and crime commissioners who commission community-based support services for domestic abuse victims and survivors and independent domestic violence advisors, IDVAs. Domestic abuse victims are automatically eligible for certain special measures in court like screens or video link, and the Pathfinder pilot in family courts aims to improve experiences and outcomes for children and families affected by domestic abuse.
Rebecca Smith.
Mr Speaker. Devon and Cornwall-based domestic abuse charity First Light South West and national domestic abuse charity Hourglass, which works specifically with older victims, have both highlighted to me the challenges they face with short-term funding streams for their work. The current year-on-year funding model results in issues around the recruitment and retention of staff, which then in turn impacts their service provision to victims. Specialist services are especially vulnerable given the nature of the support they provide. Will the Minister commit to providing sustainable long-term funding for frontline domestic abuse services, including for specialist services for older victim survivors, to better support victims in my constituency of South West Devon and across the country?
I thank the honourable member for that question. The work that Hourglass and many others do is outstanding, and I place on record my thanks to them for championing the rights of older victims across the piece. The Ministry of Justice provides police and crime commissioners with annual grant funding to commission local practical, emotional and therapeutic support services for victims of all crime types. But I am hearing loud and clear the calls from the sector. Mr Speaker, it would be wrong of me to preempt the funding after March 2025. We cannot agree that before the spending review, but the Ministry of Justice has allocated 1.2 million of funding over 2 years to support the training and infrastructure of ISVAs and IDVAs and to support these fantastic organisations like Hourglass who do such brilliant work.
Mr Speaker, another forum in which domestic violence is litigated is in private children cases in our family courts, and the Secretary of State and the Ministers will no doubt be aware of the huge delays that families are suffering in hearing their cases and those cases being heard and decided upon. And at the heart of that, the children who are waiting for a conclusion. What steps are the government taking to try and expedite those cases, in particular working with other agencies across government, including CAFCAS and local authorities?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. The government recognises the importance of supporting separating families and, where appropriate, helping them to resolve their issues quickly and without the need to come to court. This is a very complex area and one my officials and I are working closely on, and I'd be happy to update my honourable friend with a more thorough review soon.
Shadow Minister Gareth Baker.
Mr Speaker, domestic violence at its most severe becomes murder, and domestic murder is very often the most shocking and brutal. And with that in mind, what assessment has the Honourable Lady made of the Killed Women campaign?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. I'm very aware of the Killed Women campaign. I've liaised with them closely, both in opposition and now in government, and their aims are admirable. You know, any woman who is murdered by domestic homicide in this country is one woman too many. We know that sadly 3 women a week are currently being murdered, and that is a shocking statistic and one that this government is hoping to tackle.
Ralph Bacon.
Mr Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady for that answer, and in light of that, will she therefore commit to responding to the calls of Carol Goole, Julie Devi, Elaine Newborough and many others to address the injustice of the discrepancy of the starting point in domestic murder cases versus other sentences of murder, and will she do so in quick time so that she can include appropriate measures in the forthcoming Victims' Courts and Public Protections Bill?
I am meeting with the women imminently to discuss this further, and this government has committed to a thorough sentencing review.
Caller.
Question number 12, Mr Speaker.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I will answer questions 12 and 13 together. We are committed to ensuring the swift delivery of justice for victims at all stages of the criminal justice system and are working closely with various partners involved to achieve that aim. In relation to the courts, as I've said, we plan to sit over 105,000 working days in the Crown Court this financial year and continue to hear criminal cases at Nightingale Courts. We are also considering other measures to speed up justice for victims and will make further announcements in due course.
Caller.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Minister, for your answer. After waiting 7 years for the Grenfell inquiry to report, the bereaved families and survivors have now been told they must wait 2 and possibly 3 years for a decision whether and whom to prosecute. As Martin Luther King said, justice too long delayed is justice denied. I understand from the Crown Prosecution Service, who I met recently, that much of the delay is the discovery process, where the wealth of digital information must be assessed. Can the Minister tell me what is being done to address these delays and whether things like artificial intelligence are being contemplated to address these delays?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. As the Prime Minister made clear, those affected by the Grenfell tragedy have already waited too long for justice. I can assure him that anything in my power or my department's power that needs to be done will be done. The Government fully supports the Metropolitan Police and CPS as they complete their investigations and bring prosecutions to trial whilst respecting their operational independence, and I'm sure the use of all forms of technology will be considered in that process.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Perhaps too many barristers have become politicians, but however caused, how will she address the shortage at the criminal bar?
I hesitate to answer the honourable gentleman's question, given that my boss is a former barrister, and so I say we can't have too many. I have discussed the issue of adequacy of numbers of legal professionals in the Crown Court with the chair of the Criminal Bar Association, Mary Pryor, only last week, and I will be working with the profession to ensure not only that we're recruiting sufficient barristers to work in the courts, but that we're also retaining barristers at the criminal bar.
Jessica Morden.
Mr Speaker, our team in Newport used to try really hard to raise the issues of how long cases are taken for constituents, delays which we inherited from the party opposite. But even the CPS are taking months to answer even basic queries about cases on where the delays are. Can the Minister urge them to respond faster?
Minister.
I will do that, and I'll take that away.
McAllister.
Mr Speaker, does the Minister agree that a properly funded legal aid scheme, both here and in Scotland, is essential for access to justice, and that the decline that both the Tories and the SNP have presided over in this vital public service is nothing short of disgraceful?
I think what we're experiencing in this country is the very long tail of the LASPO bill, the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders bill, which meant that both the civil and criminal legal aid sectors in this country are facing huge challenges, and it's absolutely vital to people's access to justice.
We now come to topicals. Olivia Bailey.
Number 1, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On taking office 2 months ago, it was immediately clear that we had inherited a prison system at the point of collapse. That is why our emergency action, which will see certain offenders leave prison a few weeks or months early, has proved necessary, and this measure takes effect today. I pay tribute to the work of the Prisons and Probation Service. They have gone above and beyond the call of duty, both responding to the violent disorder in recent weeks and preparing for the introduction of these measures. This marks the beginning, Mr Speaker, of a rescue effort, one which will, in time, allow us to rebuild and reform our justice system in the years ahead.
Olivia Bailey.
The last government left our prisons on the brink of collapse. Can I welcome the Secretary of State's commitment to building new prisons and driving down reoffending? Can I also welcome her commitment to additional transparency? Does she agree with me that this transparency is a significant departure from the approach of the previous government, who released thousands of prisoners early in secret?
Friend is absolutely right. It is a significant departure from the approach of the previous government, who introduced an early release scheme, the end of custody supervised licence scheme, which I'm pleased to say today we have ended, that operated under a veil of secrecy with no data ever published on the numbers released, and it took our government to publish the data showing that more than 10,000 offenders were released under that scheme.
So, Secretary of State, Aberdeen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for her previous answer in substantive questions about accommodation for prisoners released early. Further to that, has the Government at the current time contracted any specific hotels for potential use by early release prisoners?
I have authorised probation directors in areas to make appropriate provision if it's proved to be needed. At this point, it is not definite that it will be required. I've allowed the provision to be there to make sure that there isn't a gap in provision for offenders being released under the SDS 40 scheme.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think she was saying there that at this time none have been contracted. If they are at any point, further to the point made by her honourable friend, in fact, will she be open and transparent with the House, local authorities and the public about how many, at what point, and in broad terms where they will be located?
Yes, I will.
Right, we now come to Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lee Dillon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Every 30 seconds, a domestic abuse-related call is made to the police. It's positive to see that the numbers of domestic abuse cases referred from the police to the CPS have increased, However, we're still well below the level seen over the last 5 years. Will the Secretary of State address these delays in domestic abuse referrals from the police to the CPS and acknowledge the unique risk that they pose?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. As I've previously stated, this government was elected with a landmark mission to halve violence against women and girls within a decade, and to do so we must improve the justice system's response to these crimes, including domestic abuse, and we must relentlessly target the most prolific and harmful perpetrators, better support victims and survivors, and ensure timely and effective justice. We will be putting domestic abuse experts in 999 control rooms and strengthening the use of protection orders, and we will be strengthening the tools available to manage domestic abuse offenders.
John Powell.
Mr Speaker, over the weekend, Lord MacDonald, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, warned that court backlogs and the complexity of any trials that may arise from a CPS decision in 2026 around the victims of the Grenfell fire may further delay justice. Could the Minister give us reassurances and the victims reassurances that the criminal justice system will not further delay justice for those victims?
As I said to the honourable member for Wimbledon, we will do everything we can to ensure swift justice for the victims of Grenfell. We do plan to sit at least 105,000 days this financial year in the Crown Court, and we'll be doing more to speed up the speed with which cases are heard in the Crown Court.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. While the Secretary of State has said that she will review her prisoner early release scheme after 18 months, will she go further and commit to ending it in 18 months, and if not, return to this House for a fresh vote on it at that point?
Yeah. I've committed to the review because I think that is the appropriate way, and to not make promises early that might not be kept. I have committed to both transparency and a review, so we will publish all of the data on a quarterly basis, and I will return to this House with the results of that review and the approach that we will take at that point going forward.
Jessica Morton.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The Minister will understand that often for very personal reasons, victims of sexual assault, like my constituent, do not always feel comfortable reporting their attack to the police, but she then found it extremely difficult to access specialist support services at what was clearly a very distressing time. What can we do to improve accessibility to support services for those victims of sexual assault who don't report to the police, and will she meet with me to discuss this case further?
I thank my honourable friend for this question. The Victims Code sets out the services and support that victims of crime are entitled to receive from the criminal justice system in England and Wales. This includes the right to access support, which applies regardless of whether they decide to report the crime to the police or not. And I would be delighted to meet my honourable friend to discuss this further.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. There are yet more depressing figures this morning about drugs-related deaths in Scotland. So can the Ministers tell us how the Government is going to discuss how drug addicts are treated within the criminal justice system and look at ways of improving that to tackle the issue and perhaps move towards safer consumption?
The honourable member is right that drugs in prisons are a big issue. It's something that the government is working hard to tackle, and I'd be very happy to write to her to give her further details on what we're doing.
Justice Otto.
Okay. Today, the first tranche of prisoners will be released early under the government's new emergency measures to address the prison overcrowding crisis. It is welcome that this government have excluded some domestic abuse offenders from the scheme. However, not all domestic abuse perpetrators can be excluded. Will the Secretary of State consider extending the victim contact scheme to all survivors of domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, regardless of the length of the time their perpetrator spends in prison?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I first congratulate my honourable friend on succeeding me as chair of the all-party group on perpetrators of domestic abuse. It's a vital APPG, and I know she will do sterling work as the chair. To confirm, we have excluded certain offences that are frequently connected to domestic abuse, such as stalking and controlling or coercive behaviour, from SDS 40. The victim contact scheme is available to all victims of a sexual, violent or terrorist offence where the offender is sentenced to 12 months or more in custody, and we are working with the sector and others to consider how to improve communication with victims about an offender following a conviction.
Stefan Curran.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Latest figures show that the court backlog sits at nearly 68,000. Every one of those means yet another individual, victim or family waiting for justice. Despite this, the government plans to cap the number of sitting days in our courts at a lower rate than last year, losing, I think, 2,000 sitting days, and this has drawn criticism from many, including the Bar Council. Can the Secretary of State tell me why those waiting for justice, including many in North Norfolk, are being forced to wait even longer? Thank you.
As I've already said, we will be sitting over 105,000 days in this financial year in the Crown Court. That is an increase of 28% on the capacity that was there in the year before the pandemic, and that means that there's more capacity in the Crown Court this year than there have been in the last 6 out of 7 years. I do think that we have inherited a criminal justice system that is on life support as a result of the previous government. We have got a broken economy and everyone can see the state of the public finances, and justice is not immune from that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Pembrokeshire, we have no local solicitors' firms that are offering pro bono work, and the nearest free legal advice centre is in Swansea. Many of my constituents are therefore unable to get access to justice, which is particularly distressing in the area of family law and care proceedings. What steps is the Minister taking to tackle the issue of legal deserts in places like Pembrokeshire and West Wales?
Access to justice is integral to a fair society, including for our rural communities. In our courts and tribunals, modernised services and more effective use of technology can improve people's access to the justice system, but I recognise there is more to do, and I'm happy to meet with the honourable gentleman.
Harding.
Mr. Speaker, a significant proportion of the 1,700 prisoners being released early today, while having been convicted of other offences, have a history of domestic abuse. What reassurances can the Secretary of State give to domestic abuse victims who fear the release of their perpetrators today?
We've taken every measure available to us and pulled every lever that we could to ensure that offences connected to domestic abuse are excluded and that the probation service has had the time to prepare, and we will work with them in the coming weeks and months to make sure that release plans are in place and victims are notified in the usual way.
Ben Goldsborough.
A widow was prosecuted under the single justice procedure after her husband passed away and the car tax expired. She was convicted over just £3.34. and the DVLA sent the letter to the wrong address. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss how we can reform the single justice procedure to make it more accountable and make sure there's better oversight of the process?
I'm very happy to meet with the honourable gentleman. I'm also very keen that we keep under review what more can be done to support vulnerable defendants going through the single justice procedure and improve oversight and regulation of the organisations using this procedure.
Boris.
Speaker, the harm done to families and women by incarcerating women is huge and made worse when they do not have safe homes after they leave. 47% of women are leaving prison currently without settled accommodation, and this breaks up families and leaves them at risk of further exploitation and harm, often the same exploitation that led to their offending. So can ministers tell the House what they are doing to ensure every woman set to leave prison, including all those leaving early as a result of the government's reforms, are supported into safe and stable accommodation?
The honourable member is right that this is a big issue. The probation service with the prison service are working hard to make sure that appropriate accommodation is there and available, and working hard with partners across the country in different regions. I'd be very happy to meet with the member to talk about this further.
Rachael Maskell.
Speaker, amazing charities like Surviving York depend on the Rape and Sexual Abuse Support Fund for its own survival. However, without certainty over the amount, if and when the funding will come, it's hard to leverage funding from other sources like the National Lottery. When will the funding be announced, and will she meet with me to discuss this vital funding as demand rises?
I thank my honourable friend for that question and recognise the vital work that Surviving York does to support victims and survivors in her area. I fully appreciate the importance of notifying police and crime commissioners and providers about future funding as early as possible in order to effectively commission, plan and deliver these services. As I've indicated, it would be wrong of me to preempt the current spending review, and we know that current providers are concerned about the cliff edge in March 2025. I do fully appreciate that, and I would be delighted to meet with her to discuss this further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Secretary of State ensure that measures are put in place in the criminal justice system to support survivors of violence against women and girls, including mandatory training for prosecutors in understanding the impact of trauma on survivors, and the release of the court transcripts for free for victims of rape?
The Honourable Lady may know that we currently offer free transcripts of the judge's sentencing remarks to families of victims of fatal road offences, murder and manslaughter. In May, we have extended free transcripts of sentencing remarks to victims of rape and serious sexual offences in a year-long pilot. We will continue to look at how we can lower the costs of obtaining a court transcript.
Uppal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Former clients of SSB law firm were unexpectedly pursued for adverse legal costs following the installation of defective cavity wall insulation. I understand the Solicitor Regulatory Authority have opened an investigation. So can the Secretary of State review the situation urgently, including establishing a cross-government working group on the matter?
I'm aware from the correspondence that I've received as the Member of Parliament for Swindon South that there are significant concerns about the collapse of law firms such as SSB, Axiom and McClure. She is right to say that the Solicitors Regulation Authority are looking at this, as are the LSB, and I'm happy to speak to her further to provide an update.
David Davis.
The Justice Secretary will be aware that the Criminal Case Review Commission took 17 years to overturn the conviction of Andrew Malkinson, an innocent man, even though DNA evidence exonerating him was available from the fourth year. And this is not the only case. So does she have any intention of addressing the resources, the regulation, the management of the CCRC to make sure innocent people aren't left incarcerated for many years?
What happened to Mr Malkinson is appalling, both for him and the victim of the crime itself. It's vital that lessons are learned, as he will know following the publication of the Henley Review into the CCRC's handling of Mr Malkinson's case. The Lord Chancellor's view is that the current chair is unfit to fulfil her duties. As for resources, the amount of resources that the CCRC has received in recent years has gone up, and we will continue to keep that matter under review.
Mr Speaker. The Minister will know that one of the things that can contribute to backlogs in courts are basic maintenance problems with the buildings, which prevents cases from being heard. In Swindon this year, we had a serious fire which resulted in one of the courtrooms being closed and cases being transferred elsewhere. What investments into courts in places like Swindon are going to ensure that justice can be swiftly delivered?
I'm very pleased, Mr Speaker, to be responding to a fellow Swindon MP from the dispatch box as another Swindon MP, and I'm grateful to him for giving me the chance to mention our hometown in my first ministerial outing. I should also say that I'm very grateful to the local judiciary, court staff and justice stakeholders for their work in maintaining access to justice during this incident in Swindon. And as the Lord Chancellor said previously, making sure that we have buildings that are effectively maintained are critical for the delivery of justice.
Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituent was brave enough to report her husband for the abuse he put her through. He's just been released from prison on 2 conditions. He would be tagged and he was not allowed to go into her village. He has not been tagged because the probation service says they do not have enough tags and it's a technical fault, and he entered her village on his first day, stayed overnight, was on her street and not his family knocked on her door. So please, Mr Secretary of State, respond to my letter about this constituent who feels very, very vulnerable, but also confirm there are enough tags and that cases like this, there won't just be a verbal warning, which is all he received for his actions, but there'll be really meaningful repercussions.
I'm not aware of the correspondence that she refers to, but I will chase that down and make sure she gets a comprehensive response.
This slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The colonial system is a mess with substantial backlogs, lack of representation of bereaved families and an erratic use of prevention of future death support. Will the Secretary of State look at reforms to deal with these problems? If she needs ideas, there's a very good report from the Justice Select Committee.
I concur with my right honourable friend. There is an excellent report from the Justice Select Committee, which this government will be responding to in due course. I'm very well aware of some of the issues that he mentions with the coroners and reporting death for bereaved families, and I would be delighted to discuss this with him further.
Whately, final question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Catapults are not classed as offensive weapons, but they're increasingly being used in my constituency to injure and kill livestock and pets. Will the Minister responsible agree to meet with me to talk about how we can deter and stop the use of catapults to kill?
I suspect that might be a matter for colleagues in the Home Office, but I will happily liaise with the relevant Minister and make sure she gets a response.
Right, that completes questions. We'll let the front benches change over.